Interpreting the Revelation with Edgar Cayce. A Commentary on Spirit, Mind, Soul and Body. By J. Everett Irion. Revelation deals more with the essential nature of man, that is, spirit, mind, soul and body, rather than personality. Revelation focuses more on the real essence that is behind our nature and experiences. Revelation is a study of self, our consciousness, natural life and mind reactions, the conscious mind, its essences and the experiences of the soul throughout the eons of time from the beginning. Revelation is also a study of the soul's creation and the soul's development process. Mind, soul and will. What is the mind? Definition of the word mind. That which is the active force in an animate object, that is the spark, or image of the maker. Mind is the factor, that is in direct opposition of will. Mind, being that control of, or being the spark of the maker, the will, the individual, when we reach the plane of man. Mind, being and is the factor, governing the contention, or the interlaying space, if you please, between the physical, to the soul, and the soul to the spirit forces, within the individual, or animate forces. We have the manifestation of this, within the lowest order of animal creation. These are developed, as the mind is developed, both by the action of all of the senses of the body, as we have them developed in man. Mind is that reasons the impressions from the senses, as they manifest before the individual. The mind of man is the governing force on earth. Yet mind is a factor of the whole being. Mind is the active factor in any animate object, not just man. Man has free will that can oppose the mind. We have a mind and we use the mind according to will. But we use mind separately from how we use will. Mind is the spark of the maker, and is the influence, factor, governing the contention between the physical and the soul, and the contention between the soul to the spirit forces, all within the individual, or the animate forces. We are a mind, developing a soul. Mind is that reasons the impressions from the senses, as they manifest before the individual. The active principle that governs man. Mind a factor, as the senses are of the mind, and as the soul and spirit are factors of the entity, one in all in one. We are speaking from the normal plane, of course. As the impressions are reached to the storehouse or memory of the body, the mind is that factor, that principle, that portion that either segregates, correlates or divides the impression to the portion needed to develop the entity, or physical force, toward the spark or infinite force, giving the life force to the body. The mind may be classified into the two forces, that between the physical and soul, and that between the soul and spirit force. We see the manifestations of this, rather than the object or the mind itself. We find this always manifested through one of the senses, the same as we find the psychic forces, a manifestation of the soul and spirit, the mind, a manifestation of the physical. Mind being in opposition to will. Explain. Mind is the factor that is in direct opposition to will. We have many phases of mind. We have the mind of the spirit consciousness, of the physical subconscious, or soul. We have the mind of the physical body, through which any or all of these may manifest. The will is that active principle, against which such manifestations respond. Hence, it is in direct opposition to mind action. This, we find then, refers to the condition in the material world, will, see. The will, in the spiritual plane, or spirit consciousness, not spirit entity, being the creation of that manifested in the earth plane. Hence, the different conditions in will's manifesting, and in how will is in opposition to the mind forces. The will, in the spiritual plane, is the creation, first created, of that manifested in the earth plane, and this will is the universal force of spirit, or the active force, in an animate object. The will of God, universal principle, is in all manifestations of spirit, which is all force, in all manifested things, or actions. The separated consciousness in man desires its own way, its own desires, to be manifested. This is in opposition to the will in the creative forces. Our will is in opposition to God's will, that is why we are in the earth in the first place. In mind, active principle, that governs man, we find the body's sense impressions are divided between the physical forces, or conscious mind actions, and those of the soul and spirit forces. Both of these, physical and spiritual forces, work toward developing the entity toward God, infinite force, which gives the life force to the body. We have briefly looked at a concept of the mind and how it works in us. We now need to consider the soul, which also involves the mind. Soul creation. As created by God, in the first, are souls perfect, and if so, why any need of development? In this we find only the answer in this. The evolution of life, as may be understood by the finite mind. In the first cause, or principle, all is perfect. In the creation of soul, we find the portion may become a living soul, and equal with the Creator. To reach that position, when separated, must pass through all stages of development, that it may be one with the Creator. As we have is this. Man. In the beginning, we find the spirit, existent in all living force. When such force becomes inanimate in finite forces, it is called dead, not necessarily losing its usefulness, either to Creator, or created, in material world. In that of creation of man, we find all the elements in a living, moving world, or an element in itself, yet without that experience as of a first cause, yet endowed with all the various modifications of elements, or forces manifested in each. For first there is the spirit, then soul, man we are speaking of, then mind, with its various modifications, and with its various incentives, with its various ramifications, if you please, and the will, the balance in the force, that may make all, or lose all. In the developing, then, that the man may be one with the Father, necessary that the soul pass, with its companion the will, through all the various stages of development, until the will is lost in him, and he becomes one with the Father. In the illustration of this, we find in the man, as called Jesus. In this man, as man, makes the will of the Father, then becoming one with the Father, and the model for man. Equality of souls and misuse of free will. Define sin, and original sin, or what was original sin? Please explain. It may be defined in one word, disobedience. In the beginning, the perfect man was given all the attributes of the Father God, in ideal environments, prepared by God, for man's material manifestation. Let's draw the comparisons of man, made perfect, through experience, and man willfully, being disobedient. In the first, we find man, listening to those influences, which were at variance, to God's way. Then in the temple, even at 12, we find the perfect man, seeking, asking, and answering questions, as to man's relationship, to God. Sin, then, is willful disobedience. Draw the comparison within thyself, as to those experiences, indicated in the first, second and third of Genesis, and those in the second of Luke, where we find our pattern, our lesson, and those illustrations, that indicate sin, versus righteousness, one willfully, seeking to know the relationship, to the Creator. Or the answer, know ye not that I must be about my Father's business? How different, from that other, the woman thou gavest me, she persuaded me, and I did eat. The above quotes deals with the creation of the soul in which an entity can potentially develop to become one with God. The potential was perfect but rebellion, see Revelation 12, and the misuse of free will, in man brought about the necessity for the development of the soul. We all have the potential for development, unfolding itself by the use of our will. Yet at the same time man acts as the creator to prove himself to be a son of God. The story of the prodigal son pictures this development through which the soul passes. Using will as the balance in the force that may make all or lose all is illustrated here. This man, Jesus as man, makes the will of the Father, then becoming one with the Father, and the model for man. Development of the soul's potential is one of the main thrusts of the readings. What does it entail in soul development? Do we leave the soul and its care to God? Or is the soul under our care? If the soul is under our care, what is involved in this care? In a reading we find a division into aspects or functions of the soul. The revelation suggests more than one aspect of the soul, and an enlightenment concept, found in connection with the development of the spirit entity, of an individual on earth as well as other planes of consciousness. The spirit entity's development is in the earth plane, that is, it brings the test of the soul's development, and this requires the physical body, for the development into one such as Jesus. It has been given that the development of the spirit entity, of this individual, Morton Blumenthal, has reached that point where it has achieved the blessing of this ability to gain the knowledge. Explain and give us the history of this development. Has that development always and only been in the plane of man? What is meant by plane of man, as given this body in a reading? Spirit entity, and its development, refers not to an earth existence or plane. The development of this spirit entity, of Morton Blumenthal, refers to its development, in the spirit entity, in other than an earth plane. The plane of man refers to the soul and spirit, forming the entity in the human, physical body, in a material world. Do not confuse each development, but consider their correlation, one with the other. Each spirit and soul, the companion of an entity's soul, its spirit, that spark of the Creator, in its passage through the eons of time, or space, developments manifest in the spiritual plane, and in an earthly plane. For the attributes of the physical makeup are but the test of the soul's environment, and for its awakening or its development, that it, the soul, may partake of those conditions necessary to develop into such an one, as Jesus manifest in the flesh. Functions of the various levels of consciousness. Does the spirit entity have a separate consciousness apart from the physical, and is it as the consciousness of Morton Blumenthal when he dreams, or has visions, while asleep? The spirit entity is a thing apart from any earthly connection, in sleep, yet connected. For the earthly or material consciousness is ever tempered with material conditions, the superconsciousness, with the consciousness between soul and spirit, and partakes of the spiritual forces, principally. In consciousness, we find only projections of subconscious and superconscious, which conditions project themselves, in dreams, visions, unless entered into the superconscious forces. In the consciousness of earthly or material forces, there enters all the attributes of the physical, fleshly body. In the subconscious, there enters the attributes of soul forces, and of the conscious forces. In the superconscious, there enters the subconscious forces, and spiritual discernment and development. In summary, to the flesh consciousness, we add attributes of the soul forces, including the subconsciousness, then all these enter the superconsciousness, for spiritual discernment and development. There is no way for man to consciously or unconsciously realize his own spiritual discernment, nor development, or of anyone else's. Now we may correlate the above ideas about consciousness with the various planes mentioned in 915 relating to development of the spirit entity and the soul. We can correlate the spirit entity's consciousness through our subconscious with the material consciousness in sleep and dreams, which relates to the consciousness of a material world during wakefulness. The spiritual essences, in earthly manifestations, are handled by the brain functions. The unseen world of spirit is comprehended also by the brain. The manifested forms and movements of the material world presents the same substance to the brain. Man's perception is limited by man's metes and bounds of understanding. The following readings clarifies the concepts above about soul development. The soul is the element that given to man, that man may be one with the Creator. Hence the developing of that portion that becomes the spiritual element, that it may be made one with the Creator. What form, or how can the conscious mind conceive of this soul in a human entity, and then in the spirit plane, after the physical has returned to earth? We have the soul as the body of the spiritual force manifested in the individual, as we find in every body, animated with the ability to reproduce in self, a thing separate from the rest of the world, yet depending upon the material world for sustenance, the same as we have in the soul, as given and separate entity. The dwelling or indwelling in man is that dependence upon the attributes of the body that it possesses, for that necessary for its development. Hence the conditions, as regard its developing, depending both upon the environment and upon the hereditary conditions, considered from the physical only. Hence the relative attraction for conditions of the soul, for that necessary development of that soul, from entity to entity, whether material or spiritual. In reality, except for will and choices, the material world and the spiritual world are one and the same, except the makeup of the soul is that body of spiritual force manifested in the individual. The total spirit, as a body of spirit actions during a lifetime, is the body of the soul. We are responsible for that.